And we are live. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Hi, everybody. We are back for Jewish Story Live. The plan today, should I be able to pull it off, is to wrap up this section of the Return to Zion. And I want to focus on the past because that is the topic of the class, but I can't help, as we do a bit of a wrap up, to have at least one eye on the present, because as folks have begun to sense, and as we've spoken about a little bit in the Conversation Club, there is a very strong echo in history between the period that we've been describing in our class and the one that we're living through now. You guys may know that expression is that, that if history doesn't repeat itself, it sure does rhyme. And then this is one of these situations in which I think that really proves true. So, okay, by way of review, where have we been? We started off with Daniel. And if you recall, the sort of primary piece I wanted you to take away from the book of Daniel is that Daniel is the mythic link. He's this bridge between that first temple period, the time in which the vision, the biblical vision of a kingdom of flesh and blood, which represents the kingdom of God in the world, had failed. And as such, he's also therefore the link between the prophetic worldview. The prophets were the leadership of that time, along with the kings and the priests, but the true spiritual leadership was the prophets, and the link between the prophetic and the age of wisdom. Just remember that vision from the second chapter of Daniel, which was given to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, that said, there's an idol which has replaced the kingship of God in the world, right? And that idol represents, in its progress through time, a mask over the face of history, right? And I explained to you that in Hebrew, Hester Yah, right, the hiding of God, which is what the Hebrew means there, can also be read as Historia, the Hebrew word. And this is one of the perspectives that we have on history. Folks could just mute yourselves. The background noise is going to get distracting. Thanks. That one of the perspectives we have on history is that not that history is, God forbid, meaningless, and certainly not that it's false, but that its primary function is a mask. And now there is a reality behind the mask, this reality of the will of God. That's why Daniel was the one who said that the task of the wise, because we spoke about it, Daniel had one foot in the prophetic and one foot in the world of wisdom. The task of the wise is to learn to read the writing on the wall. Right? They're not predicting the future in the way a prophet would. They're seeing what's there, what's emerging, right? And you can call it inspired political analysis, call it what you will, but that was sort of Daniel's model, right? Or we saw in the case of Ezra, at the beginning of the book of Ezra, where we saw the parallel between the book of Ezra and the Cyrus scroll, that Ezra wanted to teach the people to hear the will of God in the voice of the king. Remember that, right? And we said that Ezra wrote it in his book as if Cyrus called for the Jews in the name of the God of Israel to go back up to Jerusalem, which, as I said, he might have. The Cyrus scroll doesn't say that, but there's no reason to believe that Cyrus didn't send a personal letter to each group, as we see in the Purim, in the Megillat Esther, that idea of sending something to each group, each nation in its own language was a thing of the Persians. Nonetheless, if Daniel wanted the people to learn to read the writing on the wall, to see events that were already in the world that had not yet taken full shape, Ezra wanted the people to be able to hear the voice of God and the will of the king, to hear the voice behind the mask, right? And therefore to act to fulfill the wishes of the prophets, or the will of the prophets, the promise really of the prophets. Remember? Because Ezra said that Cyrus had come and made his announcement to do the will of God, to fulfill the promise given to Jeremiah. So we're going to see a lot more in the coming section about wisdom as the core leadership model that replaces prophecy. And in particular, we're going to focus on the sort of social organization that emerges around it, because the prophets fit into a very specific social organization. The kings, the priests, right? The sort of mass of subsistence farmers, right? We're going to see a very different identity and peoplehood emerge with wisdom leadership. And I'll leave it at that, because that's going to become sort of the major topic of the next section. And we will revisit that role that Ezra played as not lawgiver per se, but as law re-giver in this week's session when we talk about Nehemia. So that was the first piece, just a little bit of review on Daniel. Then we had this return, right? The Shivat Zion, the return to Zion. And it's important to remember that sort of post-game analysis that we looked at. Remember the two sages, Rish Lachish and Rabbi Bar Chana? Rish Lachish was swimming in the river, And he went to get out, and they basically, Rabbi Bar Chana said, "Oh, let me give you a hand." And then instead of saying thank you, Reish Lakish said to him, "Oh, how I hate you, stupid Babylonians." It's like one of those great moments where you realize how vicious the sages really were. Why did he say it? Because he said, if you had gone up like a wall in the time of Ezra, then you would have been like silver, which is never tarnished. But instead you didn't, and you will be like cedar, which eventually will rot. Leaving the poetry aside, what was the point? Is that 500 to 700 years after all these events, after we return to Zion, after the second temple has been well destroyed, when Israel is on the verge of truly being dispersed into the Greco-Roman world, there is an awareness of the sages that the primary failure that placed them in exile was the refusal to en masse listen for the will of God in the words of Cyrus. That the people didn't respond. Now, there's many elements that we will return to in that idea, but the one I wanted to pull out right now is it's important to remember that despite the fact that Am Yisrael operates on a sort of a theological vision of history, I've said it to you many times, that history is the unfolding will of the divine. It doesn't mean you can't miss the boat. It's a fantastic message. That's what Reish Lakish said. God called and you ignored it. We missed the boat, which means you can live inside a bad decision for 2,000 years. Will God give another chance? I guess that's part of the divine plan. We don't get to no. I mean, ultimately, Am Yisrael also lives on the faith that there's a promise which will never fail. But as I've told my kids many times, as someone who moved to Israel and has sat with his kids in bomb shelters and discussed with them, like what exactly is going to happen if Iran gets the nuclear bomb, is that the promise of God is to Am Yisrael, not to me or you. Right? Meaning it's a long-term promise, but every generation has the opportunity to either actualize or not. And so I didn't make that point when we heard that story the first time, but it's important to note that on some level, the Shivat Zion, this return to Zion under Ezra, Nehemia, Zerubbabel, etc., was a success because it recreated the second Commonwealth. The second temple will rise. We'll talk about the incredible products for Am Yisrael and for the world as a whole in that period. But at the same time, the sages ultimately saw it as a failure because it didn't last. And what was the root of the failure? When God comes knocking, you better open the door. The sound's dropping out. Is anyone else getting that, or is that just
No, it's good.
okay? So maybe that's on your end, guys. But please, thank you for letting me know, because I don't want any technical problems. Okay, so then after we saw the backstory of Daniel, we spoke a little bit about the actual sort of transition of 40, 50,000 Jews making their way back from Babylon. We spoke about this tension between the Bnei Gola, the children of the exile, and the Amei Haaretz, the people of the land. Now, we spoke about it in terms of what I would call a narrative capture, meaning what? That it was the political, spiritual, intellectual elite that were exiled to Babylon. And perhaps only them, as we discussed, et cetera, in this whole empty land theory. But even if it was not only them, I don't want to go back into that right now. The key is that group that gelled, the children of the exile, set about making themselves the mold for who the Jews are from here going forward. It's not just that the camera physically follows them in the story, leaving all these Jews behind in Babylon, who we will see again, or kind of casting any Jews that were left behind in the land as idolaters. It's that they make the substance of what it means to be the Jews. And I want to talk a little bit more about that now, because that's really one of the most important elements that deserves reflection for our day. What do I mean? Is I told you that the result of the return was a fight to establish an identity. Wall builders, right? This is the theme I said. They came back as wall builders, and we'll touch all the ways in which they did it, right? But before we go to the narrative and remind ourselves of the stories that we've already seen, I want to introduce one more theoretical piece. I hope people have begun to sense that I like to give a theoretical piece to chew on right at the beginning of the class, and then we'll get into the narrative. Don't worry. It's from social psychology. Deals with what's called the dynamic of ethnicity. How do groups maintain their identity? Right? It's something that the Jews have a lot to say about, right? And in general, maintaining identity is all about keeping a boundary between what's called the in-group and the out-group. Right? We all know this from friends when we were in high school, God forbid, right? Oh, good old high school and the in-group and the out-group. You can see it with kindergartners on the playground. And we obviously see it quite alive today within Am Yisrael, both who's a Jew internally and our struggle with the Arabs of the land in terms of like who actually is an Israeli, who is a citizen, et cetera. The in-group, out-group thing never really goes away. So what are the couple of points that I want to speak about? The tools which this is done. One is what's called the claim of continuity. Right? We're going to speak when we get to the men of the Great Assembly about the importance of a foundation myth. But there's no identity without a foundation myth. Now, there's no sense of either personal selfhood or group selfhood without some point of origin. And the further back in the past I can place my point of origin, the deeper my claim to legitimacy. So long as that claim allows me to have continuity, meaning I need to be able to not just cast my past in a useful fashion, but to be able to make sure that it belongs to me. What do I mean? Right? The Bnei Golah, the children of the exile that come back, they call themselves the men of the people of Israel. They speak about having returned, resettled, each one to their own city. Remember that whole list in the book of Ezra, which says specifically, wasn't just where they went to settle, they went back to settle. Right? And this is, of course, a big part of the argument and debate which is happening with Zionism today. In a certain level, it's the core debate between those who consider themselves Zionists and therefore are to some degree supportive of the national project of the Jewish people and those who don't, which is, are we returning or are we colonialist settlers? Which obviously isn't a blanket distinction that covers all, but on some level, that is the most core question. Are the Jews coming back? In which case it's a claim to continuity and there's an intrinsic legitimacy. Or are we just a group of Europeans who've been looking for a home and we decided to just carve it out here in the Middle East? You can probably guess which side of that equation I land on. But that's continuity, which is one of the reasons, as we spoke about, that Ezra, according to the sages, is the writer of the book of Chronicles. And as I told you, that the book of Ezra and Nehemia themselves could really be considered the sequel to the Bible. It gets tacked on to the end. Remember that the book of Chronicles ends with the declaration of Cyrus, Vayal, everybody go up. And then suddenly the book of Ezra and Nehemiah start talking about, okay, let's get it together. We're going up, right? So continuity. Also, and even more importantly, exclusivity, or what's called the claim of entirety, that the in-group, we the children of the exile, are encompass the only heirs to that history, right? Not you people of the land, not those folks who didn't come up from Babylon. We, the children, the community of the children of exile, we are the Jews. You might recall that when we read the story of Ezra forcing people to divorce their non-Jewish wives, remember that discussion we had? You can just nod if you do. If not, you can humor me and nod anyway, right? When we had that, Ezra threatened them with a very specific punishment if they didn't come and register and divorce any wives that weren't considered part of the community. What did he say? He said the punishment was, quote, their property confiscated and himself, meaning the person in question, excluded from the congregation of the returning exiles. That's the ultimate punishment. You're out. You're no longer part of a claim to this history because we, the children of the exile, claim entirety. The story belongs to us. This is a very old challenge for the Jews. And as we see when we get to the Hasmonean era, the struggle of the Maccabees, when the who is a Jew issue is going to explode into real violence. Last but not least, together with this claim of continuity, that our present embodiment is directly linked to the past, and entirety. We are the Jews and not all these other people back in Persia or these other peoples of the land that claim to know, is what's called reconstruction. I have a good friend, Yishai Fleischer, some of you guys may know him, who likes to call himself a progressive restorationist. Right? Meaning what? He wants progress, and he wants to rebuild all the stuff that we lost moving forward, the temple, the kingship, etc. So this is what reconstruction is about. If you remember, we saw that the beginning of the book of Ezra is all about rebuilding the altar, struggling to rebuild the temple. We're going to see the rebuilding of the city walls of Jerusalem. There's the sort of refreshing of the festivals of Pesach and Sukkot, the practice of reading the Torah, meaning we reach into the past, overcome the discontinuity of practice, and reconstruct. These should sound very familiar for people who are like a little bit knowledgeable about the cultural tension and discourse in Israel today. So those are the elements of what's called, in-group, out-group definition, continuity, entirety, and reconstruction. I give them to you. Keep them in mind as we go forward. Now, just to slide back into the narrative, and I do have, again, the chat's open. So if I lose anybody or you want clarification, the best thing to do is to drop a question there. But where do we see these elements of wall building already in the narrative? Number one, we had that amazing story in the 4th chapter of Ezra, where the peoples of the land come to Zerubbabel and Yoshua the high priest, and they say, hey, you're rebuilding the temple. We've been worshiping your God the whole time you've been gone. Let us help you. And I pointed out that it could have been a moment in which, just like the return was seen to be the fulfillment of the promise of God through the mouth of Jeremiah, that this could have been the fulfillment of the promise of God through the mouth of Isaiah. That Beiti Beit Tefillah Yikrei L'Kol Amim, my house will be a house of prayer for all peoples. The peoples of the world are joining together. And why wasn't it? Because the fear of a minority culture is that you'll be mushpa and not mashpia. That you will be influenced and not a source of influence. So Charlotte's question is that the Jews who remained in the land are not considered as real Jews. That's the exact debate that we're speaking about, Charlotte. The children of the exile that came back were the ones who claimed to be the real Jews. Insofar as people separated themselves, and you see this in Ezra and Nehemia again and again, separated themselves from the impurity of the peoples of the land and joined the community of the exiles, they became the Jews. Insofar as they didn't, they were mostly known as the Samaritans. And they became the lowest strata of society, Judean society. We'll speak about that more in the Second Temple period. That's a short answer to an important question. Give me a thumbs up if that works for you. Okay, great. Because I can actually see you on the screen. That's fun. Okay, so the first element of wall builders was this refusal to join together with a common project of building the temple with the peoples of the land, even though they may have indeed historically been Jewish, because it's a minority culture stance. They cannot afford to be overwhelmed. They don't have the cultural momentum to be mashpia, to just influence everyone around them. They're afraid of being mushpa, of influenced by what amounts to these idolaters. That was the first story we saw. The second one was Ezra forcing people to divorce their non-Jewish wives, which I pointed out is a unique occurrence in the Bible. Up until then, they were what were called Isrei Chatnut. There were forbidden marriages, but those forbidden marriages weren't about what we worry about today of assimilation and intermarriage. It's not what it was about. It was God said, don't marry the Moabites because they treated you bad, right? Egyptians, okay, after 3 generations, you can let them in. Those were like historical grudges. I mean, I hate to reduce God to the, angry, but that's kind of what it is, how it's presented. This is a different issue. When Ezra says, oy vavoy, God has given us one small gader, a boundary to stand behind, he's afraid of getting culturally overwhelmed. This is the stance of a minority culture attempting to prevent dissolution in a larger culture by holding a boundary, building walls. Right? Remember the example I gave you, the opposite of today, of Lucy Arish, the Israeli Arab newscaster who married the Jewish guy from Fauda, and the religious right here was going nuts about assimilation and intermarriage. I pointed out, leaving aside the halachic question, it's not really the same thing. I mean, who's assimilating into who? She's a Hebrew-speaking newscaster talking about Israeli culture, right? She's assimilating into Israeli culture. Now, that just shows you also that the halachic structures developed in exile are maybe necessary, but not sufficient to engage the reality of life as it is lived today. But that's a much longer discussion, because we're still in that mentality that we're afraid that we'll be mushpa, we'll be influenced and not mashpia. If you want to change anything, let's work on that one, by the way. That's my editorial comment. Okay, so that's the other piece. Divorce, the forbidden nature of intermarriage, something which doesn't really appear again in the Bible previously, but from this point forward becomes a core element of Jewish culture. Number 3, we saw Ezra's consolidation of the text. Remember, we looked at that amazing Gemara that first compared Ezra to Moshe, and then talked about how if he didn't actually change the text, he changed it back, and etc. I'm not going to go through it all again, but But we are going to revisit how important that role of Ezra as not lawgiver but law regiver will be in the book of Nehemia. But maybe now I'll just make the primary point, since we're putting out the framework here, which is that a fixed text, which historically speaking, we'll revisit this idea at the beginning of the Second Temple period. It appears from most textual analysis that what's called the Masoretic text, the traditional rabbinic guided text that we have in the Holy Ark today, is more or less finished by around the second, maybe even the 3rd century before the Common Era. Right? That doesn't mean there aren't competing versions out there, but the one that ultimately becomes the Masoretic text is more or less done, which is 100 to 150 years after this time period we're in right now. Why does that matter? Because as the culture of wisdom leadership, the rabbinic project, which we'll speak about at length, so I'm just going to leave it as an idea out there, the rabbinic project, as it really comes into its fullness, you're going to see how important it is that fixing the text as an inflexible, unchanging context frees its meaning. I want you to understand that. If we no longer argue about, is this the right text or not? We all agree, yes, this is it. It all came from God. It can't be changed. Great. The text is on a pedestal where it's safe and you can say whatever you want about it. Because then your argument isn't about the text, it's about what it means. And that's a very different stance. And we will speak at length about how important that dynamic between the inflexible divine text and my possession of meaning and how I negotiate between them, that's at the heart of the rabbinic project. It's at the heart of the culture of wisdom, which is coming. And it really begins with Ezra's fight to consolidate the text into one indisputable context for study. You guys understand that? Because that's a piece that we're going to pursue much more in the coming section. Okay, those are what we've seen of the wall building. Now let's talk literally about walls. Because Ezra's always lumped together with Nehemia, right? People even, there are many biblical historians who see Ezra and Nehemia as one book. There may even be versions not of the Jewish persuasion of the Bible that keep them as one book. I don't really know. But they certainly are a pair in most people's minds. Who was Nehemia? Nehemia ben Chelkia. That's what we know. Or Hachalia, sorry. Hachalia. I mispronounced his name. I'm terrible. I apologize. We have no context for him outside of his own book. Doesn't really appear anywhere else. He does appear as a brief mention in the book of Ben Sira, which I mentioned as Apocrypha. But because of that, there are many people who want to dismiss him as a historical character. We'll see, by the way, at the end, that I don't think that that's so simple to dismiss him as a historical character. But who was he in our narrative? He is the cupbearer to Artaxerxes. Most people think it was number 2, Artaxerxes II, whose reign starts in 404 before the Common Era. Now, let's remember, cupbearer may not sound like an important position to you, but in the ancient world, it was actually quite significant. Nobody gets closer to the king than the guy that hands him his wine glass. And seeing as being poisoned was a real fear for much of history, he's a pretty trusted position. And last but not least, he happens to be around whenever the king's getting tipsy, which means he can just kind of like slip a little idea in here every once in a while. So don't dismiss the cupbearer in our stories. He's not the first one we've seen. And of course, as the story goes, at a certain point in the 2nd chapter of Nehemia, his brother Hanani comes to visit the capital and tells Nehemia how bad the situation is amongst the children of the exile. This is apparently after Ezra, certainly after Zerubbabel and Yeshua the high priest, meaning the project to return has begun and it's faltering, which we saw already in the book of Ezra, the struggles with the peoples of the land and gathering against them. So Nehemia is quite upset about this. And it says that the king sees that he's upset, which is not good. You don't want to let the king see you looking blue. Everybody's got to be cheery around the king, especially when he's drinking, right? So the king says, "How does it you look so bad? You're not ill. It must be bad thoughts." And then Nehemia says he's very frightened, but he takes his chance. He says, "May the king live forever. How could I not look bad when the city of the graveyard of my ancestors lies in ruins and the gates have been consumed by fire?" Now, I want you to appreciate, aside from the poetry of the response, the 2 things that he's touching there. Ancestors. This is something that, as far as I know, every ancient culture truly takes with real weight. It's something I think, sadly, that has been a bit lost in our era, is the sense that the past makes demands upon us physically, that the graves of my ancestors should not be neglected, and the king felt that. The other one is a sense of place. He knows that Nehemiah is in exile. So even if you're in exile, if the city that you're from is at least in a glorious city, you can have some pride. But the gates, he says, right, are consumed by fire. He's basically saying, I'm in a totally lowly state. The king says to him, right, what's your request? And Nehemiah throws up a prayer, and prayer is a big theme in Nehemiah. And he says, if it has pleased the king, the servant has found favor, send me to Judah, the city of my ancestors' graves, to rebuild it. Notice the emphasis. Not entirely true, by the way. His ancestors' graves are where? In Hebron. Okay, it's close enough to Jerusalem when you're in Persia. Okay, so he gets what he asks from the king. He gets troops. He's given a writ of authority. Was it a firman, we said was the term last week? He gets a firman of authority, even some timber, which sounds like a small detail, but actually it was quite important at the time. And most importantly, eventually, Nehemiah will emerge as either the Pechach or the Tirshata. Pechach seems to be the Hebrew term. Tirshata seems to be the Persian term. They both mean viceroy. He becomes the governor for 12 successive years, plus another period, right? This is very significant because the governors before Nehemiah were not Jews, or they at least weren't children of the exile. Remember, the not Jew thing is still under debate here. They weren't children of the exile. This is a transition of power. When Nehemiah shows up, he's able to bring real political power and join it to the spiritual power that had gone with the last of the prophets and the priests into rebuilding the temple. And that's the critical transition we're going to see. So he's literally the wall builder. What has happened? The first thing Nehemiah does, if you look in that second chapter, is as soon as he gets back to Jerusalem, he doesn't even tell anybody why he's come. He takes a small group of people, goes and tours the ruins of the wall of Jerusalem, which has been completely decimated. And then he goes and he tries to rally the spirits of the people. Now, it's worth it. Actually, I have this text. I'll drop it in the chat so you guys can look at the text, because it's a powerful call he makes to them. 1 second here, capture this. And those of you who are interested in sort of leadership, you should recognize at least one element of what he's doing here. There's the text that I'm looking at. He says, you see the bad state. He brings together all the leaders. He sees, see the bad state we're in. Jerusalem's in ruins. The gates are destroyed by fire. Let's rebuild the wall and suffer no more disgrace. And then he tells them about all the good that God's done for them, all the things the king says to him. Let's start building. What's he doing? Right? This is a classic attempt to use a task to draw a group together. Right? I worked in the woods with at-risk youth for 2 years, and you have never seen anything like a bunch of emotionally disturbed, socially poorly adapted, teenagers who are forced to climb a mountain, build a tent, cross a river, whatever it is we were trying to do. The effect, and it has to be prolonged and intense, but the effect is transformative. And this is exactly what Nehemiah does, right? And by the way, his enemies help him out, because it says Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant, right? And Geshem the Arab. By the way, it's interesting, these terms, because what we see is, as I mentioned to you, wasn't just the remnants of the Jews that were left in the land. All kinds of other nations had become, just like nature abhors a vacuum, so does politics. When the Judean state was destroyed, all kinds of other sort of forces began to creep into this very strategic little strip of land. Sound familiar? Right? So they said, what are you doing? You're rebelling against the king. And he said, the God of heaven will grant success, and we, his servants, will start building. But you have no share, claim, or stake in Jerusalem. Notice, it's the same theme that we saw in the 4th chapter of Ezra, in the Hebrew I gave you, which is, it's even stronger in Hebrew. No, it doesn't say God of Israel. It says God of heaven. It's an interesting notion. We have to, I'm not going to go into it now, but I think that's a good, you're putting your finger on an interesting idea there, Adam. But I just want you to appreciate the power. Ein chelek, you have no portion. You don't have a physical piece. Tzedakah, you have no righteousness, meaning you have no justification for being here. And you have no memory. I want to remind you of this power of memory. It's a very interesting use of the Ein Lechem Zikaron. Doesn't seem to fit there until we remember that I've told you again and again, the tagline of the Jewish story is telling a story of the past that upholds a present identity, equipped to build the future. And that is what Nehemia just said to them. You have no story that can uphold your present in a way that will build the future here. That is for us to do. And I want you to appreciate that the way he does it is by building a wall, literally, together with all those other walls we spoke about. So what happens is that, so he, practically speaking, like I said, there's a group transition, and he builds the whole wall at once. If people haven't read the book, it's important. He doesn't start at one point and build the wall around. He disperses everyone and gives them each their own responsibility, and everyone builds the wall together. Now, the power is obvious in terms of a collective effort. By the way, also, even a 1 or 2 foot high wall, if it's continuous, actually has value for defense. If it will slow you down, you have to even step over it. It has value for defense. So if both as a leader was wise, tactically wise, and it also creates this model that we're very familiar with from the Zionist project, where he literally talks about how they would work with a sword in one hand, and it wasn't a plow in this case. The Zionist vision was the plow in one hand and the rifle in the other. That comes from Nehemia. Nehemia plays a very important role in Zionist historiography. People aren't familiar. But here Nehemia was the one who says that we're literally gonna have a plow in one hand and our trowel to build the wall in the other. There is a portion of Nehemiah's wall. Yes, if you guys see Adam's question there in the chat, there is a portion of Nehemiah's wall which appears in Ir David today. I could show it to you if we ever go there. Anybody ever wants a tour of Ir David, be in touch with me. We can work things out. It's a lot. It's a lot of fun. Okay, so that wall goes up, and it's finished, by the way, interestingly enough, on the 25th day of Elul, which was not so long ago. It took them 52 days ago. Just raise your hands. Does anybody know that date, what the 25th day of Elul is? According to our sages, that's the day the world was created. See, everybody thinks Rosh Hashanah is the day the world was created, but no, that's the day that Adam, that's when humanity came into being. Now, I can't help but think that that's not a coincidence. That the day that the wall of Jerusalem was completed is a parallel to the day the world was created. This is a new beginning. All life has a boundary. And in fact, with every attempt by biological, biochemists and et cetera, to try to define life, one of the ways that we define life is something which can maintain its own boundary. Which is why a virus is a suffix, if you're familiar, because the virus doesn't actually maintain its own boundary. And so here you go. On the day that the world was born, the Jews, the children of the exile, are now able to maintain their own boundary, and a new life begins. Okay, so that's through chapter 4. In chapter 5, we get a very important next layer of social construction, and I'll give you also this text so you can peek at it while we at least I'm not going to take it apart intensely, but it's worth it to hear. This is from the 5th chapter, and the topic is what I would call solidarity and the importance of righteous leadership. The topic here in chapter 5 in Nehemia is an added layer of social construction. Remember, this is what this section is about. We're nation building. We're nation building, and this is the role that social solidarity plays as or let's say solidarity is a base for social justice. Probably a better way to say it. What do I mean? Is that once Nehemia has the wall built, the people start to complain and saying that we've sold our sons and daughters into slavery. We're powerless while our fields and vineyards belong to others. And it goes on. You'll notice the ellipsis here, the dots. So they start to complain that basically they've sold everything they can to fellow Jews who at usurious rates of interest were taking first their land and then first their crops and then their land and then their children as slaves. And Nehemia unloads on the nobles. And he says, I censored the nobles and prefects, saying, we've done our best to buy back our Jewish brothers who were sold to the nations. Will you now sell your brothers so they must be sold back to us? And they got nothing to say. Right? Meaning what? Social solidarity must come before personal wealth, he says. If that doesn't happen, then we will eat ourselves alive. I'm going to say that again. Social solidarity must come before personal wealth. If that doesn't happen, we will eat ourselves alive. If someone could paint that on a large building in Tel Aviv for me, I would appreciate it. But it's a warning to us. So he says this, they kept silent, they have nothing to answer. And he goes on and he says, you're not doing it right. You should act in a God-fearing way, not to give our enemies room to reproach us. And then he speaks about his own, he makes them give it back. He makes them swear, give back their fields, their vineyards, their olive trees, their homes. And he brings the priests, he puts them under oath. And then he notes, by the way, that the entire time that he was governor, as opposed to his predecessors who used their position to enrich themselves, he did not. He's the first Israelite Jew governor that we're aware of, and he changed the model. So this is the next layer. He didn't just build the wall, he's building the people up through seeking social justice through solidarity. If you keep going through the book, chapter 7 is somewhat of a repeat of Ezra's list. There's that genealogy. And remember, we spoke about how important genealogy and this consolidation and clarification of your yichus, of your heritage, becomes in defining, are you part of the in group or are you out? Wow. And so moving forward, in chapter 8, it's actually a fundamental shift in the book. Chapter 8 is 8 and 9 really together. Are what is a model that you can see throughout the Tanakh called a ma'amad. A ma'amad, gosh, how would I translate that? It's like a public. I mean, ma'amad really is a standing, but it's a public display of past, present, and future. What do I mean? The first one is obviously Sinai, right? And there's the whole law-giving element in this that we see, that if you look once again in the 8th chapter, this is where I skipped this one. Okay, that's fine. I don't have to share it with it. This is where Ezra finally brings out the scroll, the Torah. Remember, we saw in Ezra they called him Sofer Mahir, the Torah of Moshe, a ready scribe in the Torah of Moshe. And we saw even in the letter of authority, the firman that Ezra got from the king, the Persian king, that it said, "Go teach your people their laws." We haven't seen him do it yet. That might just be coincidence, but also might just be he was waiting for the political backup. Because there's a big danger in the religious guy getting up and trying to tell everybody what to do when he has no political authority. At the same time, never forget, what do you get when you mix religion and politics? Politics, right? That is its own challenge, which we will see going forward in the Second Temple period. Nonetheless, what happens now is there's this mamad, this public gathering, and Ezra brings out the Torah and he reads the Torah publicly. And he doesn't just read it publicly, but it says that the Levites stood up with him and they explained the teaching to the people while the people stood in their places. It says they read from the scroll of the Torah, translating it and giving the understanding so that the people understood the reading. I want you to get that. First of all, it means the people didn't understand Hebrew, not biblical Hebrew. Pause. They clearly did not understand, even though he's reading from the Torah. Second of all, it means that even the sense of it, most of them were not familiar with. And there are many, many questions that flow from here. But to me, most importantly, is that this is the first, even though the sages will later say that it was Moshe who instituted, at the instruction of God, this idea of a public reading of the Torah. It's very important to me that we appreciate that we are a people has made a principle of publicly reading our story. Right? And in a traditional community, it happens on every Shabbat, every Monday, every Thursday, and then any festival that should fall in there. We publicly sit there and we read our story out loud. It's a story everybody in the room really knows. You've all heard it before. Why do we read it publicly en masse? Because the pshat, the plain meaning of text, a text that we all share, exists when it comes out of the mouth of a reader. As soon as it hits the ears of a listener, or certainly when it goes into the eyes of a separate reader, the meaning diverges, right? I know for a fact, as I'm sure I've said to you guys before, that you guys are not all hearing me say the same thing. And I don't mean in terms of your capacity of auditory, to receive. I mean, conceptually, you are not hearing the same things, and we are well aware of that. One of the ways in which we nonetheless tie ourselves together as a people is we make a point at standing together to listen to the story. There's a parallel to it, which I always find very beautiful, is the idea of praying silently together, which is a principle of Jewish prayer, right? And when the repetition of the reader comes and the reader says, "Oh Lord, rebuild Jerusalem," and everybody goes, "Amen," who knows what it looks like to the guy next to me to rebuild Jerusalem? I can't go into his soul, see what it looks like. He can't come into mine. But we both say amen. We both say, "Let it be so," to the same idea that comes out of the mouth of the person leading. And it's basically an agreement that there's something called build Jerusalem that reunites us. In the same way, when we read the Torah publicly, even though I'm going to understand it and hear it differently, when it comes out of that mouth of the reader, it's one story. So this begins with Ezra, but it already has the interpretive process, as I said, bound up with it. It's interesting, by the way, just because it's seasonal, that this was apparently also on Rosh Hashanah, and the people were quite upset, and they started to weep, and when they heard all the bad things they'd done, and Ezra and Nehemia comforts them and says, no, go home and have a party. This is where we get this idea that Rosh Hashanah is both scary and tearful, but also joyful and celebratory. And then right at the end of that 8th chapter, there's a crazy statement that it says, "And they found written in the teaching that the Lord had commanded Moshe that the Israelites must dwell in booths during the festival of the 7th month." That's the Sukkot coming up. It's very seasonal, right? "And they must announce and proclaim throughout their towns, go get leafy branches, olive, etc., myrtles," right? Most people are familiar with this. And then at the end of the description, it says the whole community that had returned from the captivity, remember, that's the Jews now, the whole community that returned from captivity, made booths, and they dwelt in their booths, has not done so since the days of Yehoshua ben Nun to that day. They celebrated Sukkot in a way that hadn't been done since Joshua. You know what that is? The whole Bible. What he just said was that except whatever was happening in the desert, they never celebrated Sukkot. Right? No, they weren't Orthodox Jews. No, that's not in any way relevant. You're correct. But what's even more powerful is who remembers reading back at the beginning of the book of Ezra that they came back and they celebrated Sukkot. It says it explicitly that they celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles, but the focus there is on the sacrifices. So there's huge debates from amongst the biblical critical perspectives, also even in the traditional perspective, what exactly is going on here? If at the beginning of the book of Ezra, it says they celebrated the festival of the 7th month, tabernacles, and the focus is on the sacrifices, because as I pointed out to you, that they returned to rebuild the altar. Right? The driving emphasis of Jewish culture at that point was we must reconnect heaven and earth. And that the altar was the place to do that. Now we're building a people. And the idea, just the poetic idea, is there has to be a dwelling place where that people can be together with God. Not just in the temple, but each individually in their own huts surrounding Jerusalem. And this is the first reference that we have to dwelling in huts actually being done in a historical fashion here in the book of Ezra, in the book of Nehemia. And the fact that it says they hadn't done so since the book of Joshua, I'll let you digest what to do with that. But I think it's important to point it out. Okay, in chapter 9 then becomes the other part of the Mamad. The first part of the Mamad of this public spectacle was the repetition of Sinai. Right now, I hope you appreciate why Ezra is now seen as the lawgiver, because he just repeated Moshe's act at Sinai. Moshe came down, brought the law, and the people immediately did something they'd never done. Ezra comes down, he doesn't give the law, but he reads it to them in a way they can understand. They all go about doing something they've never done. See the parallel? Right? But now, Nehemia begins to teach them their history. This is a very important model that you'll see with Moshe, the whole book of Deuteronomy. Basically, Moshe reviews the past in order to set them on track for the future. Joshua does it at the end of the book of Joshua. If you're familiar with what's called Mamad Shechem, he stands up at Shechem and he says, "This is the way it's been done. You guys blew it here. You blew it there." It's always very harsh, by the way. And me and my people, we're with God. You guys do what you want. They're like, no, we're with God. Shmuel, the prophet Samuel, does the same thing at Mitzpeh. If you're familiar with that, very important moment. And here, Nehemia is doing it again. right? This is something which is called mishpat. It's called mishpat. Mishpat literally means judgment, right? It's basically saying, folks, nothing happens by accident. Let me tell you a story. There was this people, God took them out of Egypt and said, do this, don't do that. Unfortunately, they didn't do that and they did do this. They got punished. Do you get the story? Let me tell it to you again. He goes through every iteration. And then what is he saying? And now here we are. What are you going to do? Right? And this is a relevant question for this season, by the way. I'm just going to throw it out there. And I don't know if any of you are in a repentance mood. It is, seasonal for the Jewish calendar. But you may wonder why it is that we are often confessing the exact same sins every year. Now, assuming that none of you are just mean, awful people that want to hold fast to the bad traits that you have. But nonetheless, I don't know about you, but I can say for me, I'm often confessing the exact same failings every year. Why is that? Why is it that we can know what we do wrong? We can strive to change it, and yet we often find ourselves right back in the same place? That is the question on a historical scale that Nehemia is posing to them. I'm not going to answer it right now, but I do want to point out one of the solutions that he poses. I'm watching the time and preventing myself from sliding into moral philosophy right now. So chapter 10 introduces a profound shift in Jewish history. And because he, like I said, he just reviewed all of history. He got him all the way up with all the failures. You got to read chapter 9. By the way, chapter 9 makes it into our liturgy. So if you're familiar with the liturgy, you'll be familiar with chapter 9 of Nehemia. Most of the chapter makes it. It doesn't all make it in. He gets all the way up to the present, and then this line says, "Uvechol zot anachnu koltim almana v'kotim." Now it's very interesting because the translation of "vechol zot" is usually, in view of all this, we are now making a pledge and putting it into writing. But in modern Hebrew, "uvechol zot" means nevertheless, and I think that Nehemiah's statement bears that meaning as well. What's he saying? Listen, we blew it once, we blew it twice, we blew it 10 times. Anybody in their right mind, looking around at this piddly little province of Yahud, which is part of the Persian Empire, where we barely managed to build a 10-foot high wall around Jerusalem, which was once the glory of the world, or the ancient world, right? Anybody looking at us is going to say, guys, this ain't going to end well. I mean, it didn't end well when you had kings and priests and prophets. Why do you think it's going to end well now? And you know what Nehemia says? Bechol zot. Nevertheless, we're going to make a pact. It's a fantastic Brit Amanah, literally means a faithful covenant. He says, "Bechol zot anachnu koltin amanah v'kotvim al chatum." Right? We are making a pledge, and we're putting it in writing. And then it gives a list of all the important people who were present who signed it. And then it says, and everybody who separated themselves from the peoples of the land to follow the teaching of God. And Charlotte, there's part of your answer. That's what I said. The people who separated themselves, not just the ones who came, who had their genealogical certificate of having gone into exile and come back. Anybody who said, listen, I'm on their team, everybody's signing. And by the way, it then goes through a list of what they're agreeing to. It's quite interesting. You should read the 10th chapter there. What's the list? We're not going to give our children to marry the peoples of the land. We won't take their daughters. Fine. We won't buy their stuff on Shabbat. Okay, fine. We won't eat the food of the 7th year, like the sabbatical year. Okay, fine. And it gives a list of temple obligations. We're going to take the tithes. You know what all this is? Everything that the Torah already told them they were obligated to do. Why are they now signing a contract, a covenant, to keep the things that they all are obligated by the Torah itself to do? Now, one answer, and one which actually plays itself out in the halachic, in the sort of Jewish legal systems, it might be that the Torah's force of obligation had been nullified by exile, and this is what we would call a rabbinic reenactment, which is interesting of itself. And like I said, we'll explore the rabbinic project in the coming section of the class. The other answer, though, is who are they swearing to? Not swearing to God. They're swearing to one another. This is a social contract. And this, I believe, is the most radical element that we see in the book of Nehemia, which is why I made the point out of pushing the solidarity as a base for social justice, is that Nehemia isn't just a wall builder. He creates the model of social solidarity, because remember, your ability to hold off other has to have a parallel in your ability to hold together self. Otherwise, all you've done is built a wall in which you'll just fight each other and eat each other alive. And that's what Nehemia said. If we do this, we'll fall apart. This is a social contract, and I got to tell you, it's an issue for me today that I hope and pray that I will live to see our country now write a real constitution and have a real commitment to all the citizens, all the human beings between the river and the sea, to borrow a phrase, that will really be based on the vision and values that we return to restore. So that's just a end parenthesis, right? So this is a radical shift we see in the book of Nehemia, and the chapter 11 and chapter 11 and 12 are basically the refurbishment of Jerusalem. They choose by lot a certain percentage of the people who are committed to live in Jerusalem. We see a rededication of the temple. Fine, you can read it yourself. The last piece is chapter 13. And chapter 13 takes us really to the close of the book of Nehemia. And will let me, I think, in the last few minutes, just wrap some things up. So chapter 13 has a very interesting incident in it, which I want to show you here. You guys have this in the source book, right? Here's Nehemia 13. It says that I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on Shabbat, others bringing heaps of grain and loading them onto donkeys, etc. And he admonishes them. And then there were all these foreign merchants that were coming and trying to sell on Shabbat. So what does Nehemia do? Here it is. He says, when the shadows filled the gateways of Jerusalem at the approach of Shabbat, I gave orders that the doors be closed and not be opened until after Shabbat. He stationed his servants at the gate so no goods should enter on Shabbat. He used the physical walls of Jerusalem that he had rebuilt to uphold the walls of Shabbat. This is the first reference we have since the story of, if you're familiar with Mekoshesh Eitzim, the guy who was gathering sticks on like the first or second Shabbat in the wilderness, right? And they stoned him for it. This is the first instance we see of someone asserting their authority to enforce religious law in the way in which we associate it today, which is why the sages in Shabbat say that it was in the time of, right? Here it is, in the days of Nehemia, son of Hakaliah, right? That when many stringent decrees were issued with regard to Shabbat prohibitions, that they see Nehemia as the beginning of this process. Now, we're not going to have time to speak about it today, but we'll reference back to this, that Nehemia is the beginning of the legal judicial culture, which we come to know as the rabbi. There's a last piece. Yeah, it's not too much squeezing, because it's a fantastic historical record. In history, we say no news is good news, right? Meaning the written record of the Second Temple period has a break from the book of Nehemia all the way through the book of Maccabees. So we're talking about almost 300 years, 250 years. And in history, no news is good news, because if things are exciting enough to write them down, they generally weren't going all that well, right? Except for what are known as the Elephantine Papyri, which you have here a description where there was a Jewish community on an island in the Nile, which was known as Elephantine. It was originally a military installation. It probably functioned in the later years of the Persian Empire as a tax outlet, tax outpost. It's not critical, but there was a group of papyri, which is ancient paper, that were found written there in Aramaic, and one of them is known as the Pesach letter. Now I'm going to read this to you. It says, to my brethren, Yodoniah and his colleagues in the Jewish garrison. This is written to the Jews who held the garrison on the island of Elephantine. Your brother Hananiah. There's some who want to say that this is actually Nehemiah's brother. The welfare of my brothers, may God seek at all times. Now this year, the 5th year of King Darius, word was sent from the king to Arsames, we're assuming that was the governor, saying, from the king, authorize a festival of unleavened bread for the Jewish garrison. Get the Jews to keep Pesach. And now listen to these details. Count 14 days of the month of Nisan. Observe the Passovers from the 15th to the 21st. Observe the festival of unleavened bread. Be ritually clean. Don't work, nor drink beer, nor eat anything in which is leaven from the 14th at sundown to the 21st. This sounds like the Pesach that we know and love. So the elephantine, well, I mean, or at least that we know. I don't want to assume anybody loves Pesach like me, but that we know and work with. Um, the I want you to see the parallel. It's fantastic that the book of Nehemia itself records him as using his political position to enforce religious law. The sages picked up on this and saw this as the beginning of a judicial process. We'll discuss that going forward. But here we have extra biblical evidence that indeed the governor of Yahud, the Judean province of the Persian Empire, had the backing of the emperor to enforce the religious law, Pesach, the way you know it. Don't drink beer or eat any unleavened bread. Order the garrison to do so. So in this we see, and I think in the last 2 minutes here, we'll leave the rest of it for picking up next week, which is fine. In this, we see at this point that the return has succeeded insofar as it has created life. Remember I said to you, the minimum definition of life is that it can maintain its own boundary. The wall builders have succeeded. They've consolidated the entirety of the story. They are the Jews. They have a sense of continuity, that they know where they came from. They're from what town, and their genealogy is clear. And if their genealogy isn't clear, they're kept to the sides, right? It's exclusivity. They've also said, oh, those peoples in land, they're not us. Those Jews back there in Persia, we don't talk about them, right? And they've managed to reconstruct. The temple is standing. The altar is built. It may not be the same impressive one that was in the first temple, nor will it be as impressive as the one that Herod builds, but it has the power to continue the story.